Welcome back to the podcast. I am so pleased to bring in on the show, first time ever, Elliott S. Maggin, one of my idols growing up as a kid. Elliott, before we talk about everything else, tell the fans your origin story and how you got into comic books as a kid.
My origin as a kid, I
Yeah.
used to read them at Andy's barbershop in Brooklyn.
What were the first comics you read?
Superboy. There was a Superboy story about aliens flying around in little spaceships that were the size of butter trays. And I tried to get it reprinted. We were reprinting a bunch of old comics when I was an editor. And I couldn't convince them. I couldn't convince the other editors it was any good. So I guess it wasn't. But it got me hooked. And I learned to read using comics. Captain Kangaroo and Superman. I learned to read.
Have you always, goal in mind had always been to be a comic book writer? Or did you just fall into it?
I didn't fall into it. That wasn't really, if I had a goal, it was to be president. So I blew that one. But I got in because I wrote a term paper that included a comic book story, a Green Arrow story. And I got a B plus or B minus on it. Thought I deserved an A. So I sent it to Carmine Infantino, who was the publisher at DC at the time. And he never used to read anything. So he gave it to Julie Schwartz. And Julie never had time for anything. So he gave it to Neil Adams, who didn't want to read it, but he read it on the train on the way home. And he came in the next morning and said, if you buy this, I'll draw it. So that's how I got started.
When was your first comic book story published?
1971. Superman was like out of phase at the time. I used to like him despite everything. So I did a Superman story maybe 2 or 3 months in after I wrote my first one. That was What Can One Man Do with the Green Arrow story. Must There Be a Superman was the Superman story.
And what was the story about?
The Guardians of the Universe got in touch with Superman and said, listen, we got a job for you if you take it. There's this big yellow asteroid or something that's about to crash into an inhabited planet. Would you move it, please? So he went and moved it and then went to hang out with the Guardians. And they planted this idea in his head that he was impeding the normal social growth of humans by just being there, by eliminating despair. If you're hanging from a twig under a cliff, you don't give up because Superman will show up. You don't do anything about it because Superman will show up. And generally he doesn't. So the Guardians were criticizing him for that. And he took it to heart. It pretty much served as a baseline for all the Superman stories I did after that.
Is it true that no one wanted to write for Superman and you and Carrie Bates teamed up to make Superman more like Superman should be?
That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, I won't argue with that. Len Wein was writing a bunch once in a while. Denny O'Neil had been writing it for a year, and he just hated writing it. He just didn't think Superman was realistic. And I told him, no, that's not true. I told him that Superman was a much more likely character to occur in real life than Batman, and he never got that.
How long before you became one of the big Superman writers where it's, this is my thing, right off the bat?
I never noticed. We didn't have internet then. We used to get these piles of fan letters, and every once in a while, Julie would ask me to read one. But he got them. I never got them. So it didn't occur to me that I was doing anything out of the ordinary until about 20 seconds ago when you did.
Do you recall how many Superman stories you wrote over the years for the comic books?
About 100.
How many of those do you think really stood up and are really good?
Maybe 20%.
During this time, Carmine Infantino was the publisher during a good chunk of your time at DC. What was he like?
He was very tall. He was trying to hide the fact that he was bald. And he used to smoke these big, or he used to have these big cigars. And I don't think I ever saw him smoking one. I think he just chewed on them. But that's just in retrospect. It may be that he smoked one once in a while. But normally he had him in his mouth, and he talked like out of the other side of his mouth. He was a character. He was overbearing. He was always funny. And what he mostly did was he designed covers. That's mostly what he did. He had been editorial director, which meant that he designed the covers. So there was, when Kinney National bought the company, they saw that there was one editorial director and about 6 editors. So they figured he must be in charge. So they named him president. but his job stayed the same. He designed covers. Although after a while, he was doing it in a nicer office. People started deferring to him just because he was president of the company. And he didn't quite know how to handle that, but he liked it.
Is it fair to say that he was a reluctant publisher?
No, I think he liked being the publisher. But I think he liked the big office and the title. Mostly what he did was his old job. And things went humming along. When he designed a cover, it was a better cover.
So many of DC titles, including the Superman stuff, slumped in the 1970s. And a lot of people attribute to Infantino as being publisher. But I think that the higher ups actually cared more about the comic book division because they didn't care about it. And that's common knowledge. Do you think the erosion of readership would have been different? And maybe if Carmine got a little more support from the higher ups?
Yeah. Yeah, support from the higher ups is always a good thing to have. I think readership eroded more because of other media becoming more accessible. I went to work for Atari in 1979 or something. It was this thing I was doing on the side. And they taught me how to program in BASIC, and they sent me a computer, and I started getting prompted from an increasing number of devices over the years. It's just that my watch and my phone and my computer and my television all tell me what to do, and I pay no attention to them because it's an increasing number of devices. That's pretty much why comic book sales started to erode, I think, just as book sales started to erode, because people were amused.
So I read somewhere that you said the Superman story was a retelling of Moses, and I never thought about it until I read that, and it makes sense. Do you remember when and how you made that particular connection?
I must have been 10. Yeah, Moses in the bulrushes, Moses, the baby being cast away because he's in danger, and finding out who he is and leading his people. That's the Superman story. It recurs in a lot of cultures and a lot of different guises, but it's an old story. And I think that's who he is.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
People identify with other people. When you read stories about aliens, they all have 2 arms and 2 legs and 10 fingers. Clark is this character Superman invented. And he's real interesting. Superman gave him hobbies and gave him cares and developed a girlfriend for him and things like that. Superman is more like us because of Clark. People say that the real character is Clark and Superman's the construct. I think it's the other way around. The hero is your best self, the most potent self, historically in literature. So that's who this character is. Clark is this costume he puts on.
So you also have said in the past, it isn't about how powerful Superman is, but the choices, and that's what the story should have been about. Was that kind of like your template when you wrote your stories?
Yeah. Your first question you ask yourself when you write a Superman story is, what do I do in this situation if I have all the power in the world? So essentially, a Superman story is about us making decisions, which is something all of us have to do at any one time. None of us have all the power in the world, but given that we did, what do we do? What do we want the world to turn out to be? A little corner of it. That's what Superman stories are about.
Did you feel, as you look back, that you really got Superman, or if you had a chance to go back, I would have done this a little bit differently, or were you pretty much satisfied with your stories overall?
There are stories I like and stories I didn't. I think I was in my 40s before I realized I knew story structure. Story's a tripartite thing. There's a decision, a conflict, and resolution, and they all happen at pretty much the same time. And I think the ones that come out the best are those that fit into that pattern most neatly. And I've always tried to break the pattern to see if I could do better, and I really can't. It's like William Goldman wrote, stories are structure, scripts are structure. The structure is more important than the content in many cases, because humans receive information in one way. It's in the form of a story. I was just listening to an interview of Margaret Atwood. She said, we're a storytelling culture. If we didn't fit ideas into stories, we'd be in a lot better shape and we'd be much less interesting. I think the whole universe is built on fractals. It's 3 rays of a triangle leaning on each other. Everything's like a geodesic dome. And a story is like that. Every good story is like that. You have a decision, conflict, resolution, act one, act two, act three, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, subject, verb, object. Everything is in three pieces. And you just put them together, and when they fit, you got a story.
Do you consider writing for Superman a privilege that you had?
Absolutely.
Did you realize it at the time, or was this something afterward that a light bulb went out and go, man, I was really lucky?
I don't think I realized it at the time, but I do think I got really lucky at a really early age. Yeah, it was definitely a privilege. This is the iconic character of our time. The one. If he didn't exist, we'd have to create him. The whole time I was writing comics, I tried to figure out what comes next. And it was never as good. I went to journalism school while I was writing Superman. I wrote a few pieces for the Village Voice and a couple other newspapers. And I thought that's what I'd end up doing. I was going to be White House correspondent for NBC News. But I never did that.
How old were you when you broke into comics?
I think 20, maybe 19. I'm not sure. I was a junior in college, whatever age that is. And I wrote that term paper. And that got me started. That was good for 30 years of work.
What were some of your favorite supporting characters?
Luther, Perry White, Black Canary. I like Jimmy more than other people seem to, Jimmy Olsen. I think he's much more interesting than people realize. And when Jack Larson played him on television, he gave him meat on his bones. People identify Jimmy as a major supporting character in Superman, and they don't know why. It's because he has a story of his own. Lois, to some extent. But for a lot of the time Lois has been around, she's been the required female character. She's always been his squeeze, but Perry's much more interesting. I gave Perry sons and gave him names and gave him a wife. And every once in a while, somebody refers to Perry's family.
What were some characters you didn't like writing about?
I always turned them into somebody I liked. I edited the Challengers of the Unknown series, the first 7 or 8 episodes that Jeff Loeb and Tim Sale did. And I didn't like them until I read their version, until I read Jeff's script. I really liked that. I don't think there are characters I didn't like. I made them all into people I would want to hang out with.
What were some of your favorite stories that you wrote?
There was a series of stories in Superman number 400. That's my favorite of all of them. That was Superman hardly appeared in that. It was all about the future. It's a series of little stories, each drawn by a different artist who had never drawn Superman before. And each one dealt with some future period in history. And I wrote all of them except the one Jim Steranko wrote. I called up Jim Steranko. I wanted him to draw one. And he said he'd be insulted not to write his own script. I said, fine. So a week or two later, he calls me up and reads me the whole script on the phone. And it was really good. It wasn't anything like what I'd been writing, but it fit in fine. And it was beautiful. I don't know if he's drawn anything for comics since then, but it was outstanding. My favorite story among those in that book was the one that was drawn by Al Williamson about a colony on the moon, where the moon is made up, the inhabited part of the moon is made up of a bunch of domes that are connected by tunnels. And there's no internal combustion on the moon because they didn't want to pollute the domes. So everybody went around on horseback. So it looked like the Old West on the moon. It was so weird. And the thing I liked about it at the time, I wrote it as a 6-page story, and Al said, I can't fit this into 6 pages. Let's make it 8 pages. I said, fine. And I got paid for another 2 pages, which was wonderful.
In the early 70s, we all know about how Julius Swartz and Denny O'Neil made significant changes to Superman. They made him less powerful. Do you think that was the wrong approach to Superman at the time?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why?
Everybody who takes over Superman seems to, the first thing they do is make him less powerful. I made him more powerful. Again, the point is not to give him adversity that he can't handle. The adversity he has in the course of a story is what choices to make. Yeah, they all want to make Superman less powerful. And the whole point of Superman is that he's pretty much all powerful. And the trick is to make the stories engaging on that basis. When people start out by saying he's too powerful, let's make him less powerful, they're not writing Superman stories. They're writing Iron Man stories.
So is it true that Julie Swartz really didn't want to do the Superman titles at the
He
time?
didn't want to do them?
Is that true?
No. I think he was fine with it. Yeah, he wasn't familiar with Superman until he took over the Superman in Action books. So he had to learn about him. He had to learn about the character. And Denny was familiar with him, and Len certainly was. So by the time I got there, he was pretty comfortable with it. He made a few changes that I didn't like the idea of. I wanted to do a classic Superman thing with Clark's a reporter and Perry's his editor and Lois is Squeeze. And he put him on television. Julie wanted me to put him on television. I said, fine, because I was in journalism school at the time, so I knew all about television. I had a big reunion of my journalism school class a year or two ago, and I told them all that I think I went to journalism school because I was writing Clark Kent stories, and I wanted to know what his life was like. And I realized that was pretty much true. I concentrated at Columbia on broadcast. I learned all about the way you do broadcast journalism in 1974.
Why did you stop writing comics?
I wanted to do Superman, and they gave it to John Byrne, and I didn't want to do anything else. I didn't want to take spot jobs. They called me, asked me to be an editor for a while, and I didn't like that job. I was there for a year and a half, and I quit, or I got fired. I'm not sure which. The story is I got fired for making changes to Challengers of the Unknown that weren't authorized. In fact, they were authorized, but some other editors objected, and I just took off and moved to California.
So, what was it like working with Julie?
I loved Julie. He was like looking at myself as a grown-up. I said, oh, this is what's going to happen. He was a Jewish kid from the Bronx, and I was a Jewish kid from Brooklyn. So we were the same. I knew what was going on in his life pretty much, and he didn't share that with hardly anybody. When his wife died, I invited him to my brother's house for a Passover Seder. He hadn't been to one in 50 years. We had a good time.
Were you close to him?
Yeah, he was a pal. The way you have any pal. Sometimes you're in touch and sometimes you're not. But we fought all the time. Every time we did a plot conference, we yelled and screamed, and he'd close the door and people would gather outside the door to listen to us yelling. It was heartwarming.
Would you go in there and pitch a story, or would he pitch a story and then you guys just had it out?
He had this brain that was working all the time. He was much smarter than me. And I don't say that about many people. But I would come in with a bare bones idea and he would just run with it. And that's what I'd go home and write. We would hash it out and I'd say, no, I don't want to do it that way. I want to do it this way. He says, no, you got to do it this way. So after a while, I figured out that there was this one idea that he was married to in every story. And as long as I had that in there, the story was okay. But he trusted me to come up with a story that fit into roughly the plot we had discussed. And I trusted him to be smarter than me. He knew what he was doing.
What was the most significant lesson you learned from Julie?
Story structure. What I said before about a 3-part story. He used to say beginning, middle, and end. And I realized each one had its own character.
How did your relationship with Julie's evolve over the years you were working with him?
Every once in a while, we'd have an argument that went on for more than that day. There was one point when there was a story I wrote that I disagreed with the outcome. And he insisted on having it end a certain way. So I took my name off it. And I didn't get work from him for about a month and a half. So I went to Stan Lee and I said, I need 4 books a month. My editor's mad at me. He took me upstairs and put his arm around me and he said, hey, Jerry, give Elliott some work. Gave me a Spider-Man story. It was in Peter Parker number 8, 9, something like that. It was early.
Did you do much work for Marvel?
I did a Hulk. I did a Spider-Man. I did an Iron Man story at some point. I did a bunch of Spidey super stories, which were an Electric Company production. So they were kids' versions of Spider-Man stories. I like Spider-Man. He was a good character. My favorite character over there was Doctor Strange, and I never got to do one of those. I should have yelled at them. I wanted to do Doctor Strange.
How many conventions do you do a year?
Lately, since the pandemic, I've just been going to San Diego. They invited me to North Carolina, and then the pandemic broke out. I'd like to go there again. I have a cousin there. I was doing about 5 or 6 a year. which was about all I could handle. Julie used to do one every week or two after Jeannie died. That was his social life. I went to Ithacon, the Cornell thing they have every year. I don't know if they still have it. But I went there, and everybody I knew was there. This was early 1986, and I gave Julie a ride up there. And yeah, I don't know. Kurt Swan was there, and I had never gotten along with Kurt because Julie played us off against each other. He used to get me to go down and get him bean soup when Kurt was coming in with artwork because he didn't want me to talk to him. At some point over the weekend, Kurt says to me, "Young man, would you like to have a libation?" So I sat down and had breakfast with him. And he drank scotch and I drank vodka for about 4 hours. And we had a great time. So we were friends since then. And we stopped working together not long after that. But he was a good guy. He was a real good guy. I liked his politics.
Who are the Elliott S. Maggin fans these days?
They recognize my name. I think I can walk through the San Diego Comic-Con and not be recognized. John Mulaney, when he went to rehab, he was saying in his last comedy special, he says he was worried that he would go to rehab and everybody would like flock to him and surround him and be interested in him and be in his way. And what really turned out to be was that nobody knew who he was. That's the way it is at conventions. Every once in a while, somebody knows who I am.
What's your favorite part about doing the conventions?
Walking around the hall. That didn't used to be fun. I don't know why, but now it's my favorite thing. I get so many Atari t-shirts these days that people think the company's still in business.
Last fall, you released a new novel called LexCorp. Tell the fans about that, how it came about.
LexCorp. I created LexCorp, the company, in a Superman story, which you may have on your wall. It was like Superman 416. It was one of the last ones I wrote. And they referred to LexCorp as the company Luthor founded years after his adventures with Superman. And they started to make friends after that.
I didn't know you created that.
Yeah, I created it. And when John and Marv took over the character, they ran with it. They projected Lex into what I perceived as his future as an industrialist. There's a DC wiki online. And for years, they kept attributing the creation of LexCorp to John Byrne, which is not true. I'm glad he took it and ran with it, but I wanted credit. I wanted credit for what I created. So they changed it. They made me the creator in name as well as in fact. And it's been showing up everywhere. It's on all the TV shows. It's in all the movies. And I never get credit for it, but at least it's there. So I decided I was going to assert myself. I wrote a LexCorp book. And it's basically Luthor's hero adventure. He gets to save the Earth in the course of this story, which I think everybody should do sometime in his life.
Did you have to get permission to do that?
I did it. And I said, "You want to publish this?" And they said, "We're not publishing novels anymore." I said, "Really?" So I finagled a little bit and ended up doing it under my own imprint, which is fine. They don't seem to be worried about it.
I had forgotten you wrote the novel adaptation of Wade and Ross's Kingdom Come. How did that come about? Did you enjoy it?
It was a lot of fun. Mark Waid called me up one day and said, "Have you read Kingdom Come?" And I said, "No." He said, "Well, I want you to do the novelization of it." And I said, "I can't do that. The deal is awful. They don't pay you enough. It's not real royalties. It's like a piece of royalties." And I just didn't want to do it. And he said, "Okay, read what I've got out and I'll send you the last 2 scripts." So he sent me lettered pencils for issue 3 and just the script for issue 4. And then at the end of issue 4, he dedicated the damn thing to me. So I called him and I told him, "You put me in a hell of a bargaining position. Now I have to write the novelization." So I did, because he dedicated it to me.
Did you add stuff that wasn't in the series itself?
I did add stuff. And I got in trouble for adding a bunch of, at some point, I changed a joke. In some context, Mark had written a joke. And I said, "Okay, I'm writing the book. I should write my own joke." So I'd write my own joke. And I thought it was pretty funny. And Mark yelled at me and said, "No, I worked really hard on that joke." So I put it back. Yeah, it was hard to write it with people looking over my shoulder. They pretty much gave me my head until I was done with it. I was sending pieces of it to Mark and Alex and my editor. But then when it came back with all these editorial changes on it, I hit the roof. And there was no reason for most of them. So that was a long negotiation process. And they actually postponed the book for a couple of months because of that. Charlie Kochman was my editor. And eventually, Charlie just took his pencil and made the changes he wanted and gave it to Warner Books. And that was that. It came out okay. I liked it.
So you're glad that you did it?
Oh, absolutely. It was a great story. It was like seeing my universe come back. And they had left it for a while. It was really the reapplication of that Bronze Age stuff.
Did you write Superman the same way, basically, as you did for the comics in the 70s?
He was older, that's all. I wrote him as the same character. I killed off Lois at some point. I wrote the story of how she died, and that wasn't in the comic. I didn't want her to die, but she did in the comic book, so I made up a story about the Joker falling out a window with her, the two of them together falling out a window, and that's how she died. I actually wrote that at the San Diego convention. I found an empty room somewhere and just sat there typing.
Take you to write the novel?
4 months. And then it was another 4 or 6 months to argue about it.
So you had the novel, The Last Son of Krypton. That was DC's response to the Superman movie because Puzo wouldn't let them do an adaptation.
Puzo kept the rights to do an adaptation, to write the novel himself. And his idea was to let his son, Gene, write it. And Gene had been a friend of my brother's. And my brother couldn't see Gene writing a book. But Puzo wanted him to write a book. And he never did. I don't know what happened with regard to that. But Mario had various arguments with the Salkins. He was pissed at him. So he retained the rights to the novelization of the movie. And I had written this book, The Last Son of Krypton, based on my idea of what the screenplay should have been. Or it was my treatment for the screenplay. They were going to bring my book out between the two movies, the first two movies, to keep interest up. And when they realized they didn't have a novel to come out with the first movie, they issued mine, same day as the movie. And I got this phone call about 3 days later. I was living in New Hampshire at the time. I got this phone call from Saul Harrison telling me that Alexander Salkin wants to sue your ass. And I said, why? He says, there are too many incidents in the book that were similar to the movie.
So
then I saw the movie. I mean, I didn't go to the premiere or anything, but I saw the movie, and I didn't think it was anything like my story. But Carrie Bates and I had sat down with Mario for 2 days, smoking Cuban cigars and talking about Superman. And Mario didn't know the character. He didn't know anything about him. So we explained it to him. And he looks up and he says, oh, wow, this is a Greek tragedy. I said, yeah, that's what we've been trying to tell you. Because it had the same structure as all the ancient myths, which he got, he understood. So he wrote a screenplay that was about basically Zeus.
How did he get to be screenwriter for Superman? He seems like an unlikely choice.
Okay. I wrote a memo sometime in 1974 saying it's time for there to be heroes again. Let's do a Superman movie. Gave it to Carmine. I didn't know who to send it to at the studio. So I just gave it to Carmine. And Carmine said, yeah, this is great. And he floated the idea of doing a movie to his overlords. And eventually it evolved into what it did. My memo with the story in it, with my Last Son of Krypton story in it, never got up the chain, really. One for Bester, The Star Is My Destination. He wrote Green Lantern's Oath. Did you know that?
Did not know that.
He was writing Green Lantern he was the original writer on the series. He got Julie Schwartz's job. And I loved his novels and his stories. So he shows up at the office, and I had talked to him on the phone over a couple of things, but I had never met him. He shows up and he says, I'm writing the Superman screenplay. And I said, well, that's good. You're writing my Superman movie. He said, I guess so. And then we didn't see him again. And he died soon after that. So I came in one morning, and Mario Puzo was sitting on the floor of the archive room, the room where they keep all the old comic books, with Nelson Bridwell, the two of them, these two ponderous men sitting on the floor in the library. So I told him I was thrilled to meet. I never told him that my brother was a friend of his son's. I never got around to that. But Carrie and I did spend a couple of days with him. I said to him at some point, how do you get to be a big deal screenwriter in Hollywood? And he says, you have to write a bestseller and have them come to you. And he was right. The two Superman novels were both bestsellers. but I haven't been able to do that trick since. I keep writing books and sending them out into the wind, and I'm working on
So,
a science fiction trilogy now. Maybe that'll do.
so your 1991 release of Miracle Monday, was that considered a sequel to what you wrote for Last Son of Krypton?
Yeah, that was a sequel. It was an independent story. They marketed it with the second movie. They put Chris Reeve on the cover and sold it as if it was a novelization of the movie, which it was not. People tell me now that they were disappointed to find that it wasn't the same story, but then when they read it, they said they were thrilled. People still buy it.
Is it true that you like own the rights to the novels, that you can put them out anytime you want? Is that how that works?
No, I put a clause in there that I could use the characters.
DC doesn't have a problem with you reprinting it over and over again?
No, because I asked them for years to republish it and they never wanted to. So finally I did. And I didn't know I could do that at the time, but I did. This place out on Long Island, this publishing company, pirated both books and put them out in their own editions. And they were basically hardcover versions, Xeroxes of the paperbacks. But they were selling them like nobody's business. And I got wind of it and let the people at DC know. And they just ignored it for a while until the guys at Warner Books decided to put them out of business. Eventually they did. I think because I objected.
So why do you think those two novels are still popular after 40 plus years?
Because I didn't write them as adaptations of somebody else's story. I wrote Superman stories, and I know how to write a novel. Yeah, I approached them as stories, just plain old stories, the way you would approach any novel. And one of the characters was Superman. I think that's why they worked, because I wrote to the medium and I knew the characters. That's all I can come up with.
If given the chance, would you go back and write some Superman stories?
Somebody asked me a while ago what I would have done if I'd stayed on Superman, and I didn't know. I knew I had lots of stories left to tell, but I think what I would have done and would do now is to develop his relationship with Luthor, because I always suggested that one of these days they'd be friends again. And I'd like to tell the story of how that happens.
Looking back, would you have treated your Superman stories any differently than you did? You're 20 years old. Do you have any regrets or things I should have done better? Or you're pretty good with it.
Yeah, there are a lot of things I do better. I'm a better writer now, just because I'm older and have more experience with stuff. When I was in college, somebody said, one of the professors said, you should write a novel. And I said, I'm 20 years old. What would I write about? And he didn't have an answer for that. So I wrote my first novel when I was 26. I knew something about Superman. I didn't know much about life. But I wrote this book about real life called Not in My Closet, about a couple who break up because she's gay. And I don't know, it didn't make much of a splash, but it's out there. I think I'm interested in writing about people who fly.
When did you start putting the exclamation point after your S for Elliott S. Maggin?
Sometime in 73 or 74. I did it by accident. I was used to going over that corner of the typewriter because we ended all the sentences in exclamation marks. They used to reproduce comics on the cheapest paper they could find through this arcane process that involved coloring every color with red in a sweatshop in Connecticut. We had to put exclamation marks at the end of every sentence because there were impurities in the paper and there could be periods anywhere. So I got used to going to that end of the typewriter to punctuate my middle initial. And Julie saw it one day. I'd accidentally done it on the credits for a script. So he went down the hall and he said, he made an announcement to the production department. From now on, Elliott's middle name will have an exclamation mark after it. He has a typo in his name from now on. And I've kept it for a while. I opened checking accounts with it. I don't think it's on my deed, but it might be. I use it everywhere. Nobody seems to object.
One more question. What do you think or hope your legacy would be for what you did for Superman one day?
I think I made him more human. I made him more super, but I did make him more human, and I think that's the more significant thing about him. I made him an Earthman, despite the fact that he was born on Krypton. I don't care what they say. He was born on Krypton. That's his story. He was cast out. but he became one of us. He's not
Elliott S.
separate.
Elliott S. Maggin, this has been a fantastic taping. Thank you for joining me on this podcast.
Certainly been fun.
Thank you so much for coming on.
Okay. See you soon.